draw more fluids into the circulatory system. So how is lower salt going to address the VCOP? It's going to lower the VCOP. So then that's lowering the solute concentration inside the vessels because we ate less solutes. So we're going to draw less fluid in to equalize out that high solute concentration. So then that's going to do what to the blood volume? Decrease the blood volume. Because we're not drawing as much fluid back in, so that's going to help decrease the blood pressure.
So then that would also lower that other pressure that's going out.
Mm-hmm.
But the VCOT has to lower first, and then it would lower.
Right. So it would be back to lower the CHP. So the VCOP is going to go down because you ate less salt.
Yeah.
And then that CHP is going to go down both because fluid moved out and because you have lower amounts of salt. Mm-hmm. Makes sense? Alright, so cardiac arrhythmias happen a few times every day in healthy people. And it's a good thing to tell people that are freaking out and monitoring their heart rates all the time. Just happens. If they happen more than just a few times a day, they can reduce the pumping efficiency of your heart, then it has to contract more and it can start to fatigue. Alright, so again, what I want you to know about these ECGs are what is happening at these peaks for a normal ECG. You're not going to need to be able to look at abnormal ones. But remember, what you're seeing here is not heart contraction. You're not seeing heart rate. You're seeing the electrical signaling through the heart. Okay. So if you see a junctional rhythm, it's usually because the SA node is non-functional. And so you lose those P waves. And then the AV node paces the heart at a slower rate. So the heart rate drops. Heart block prevents conducting some of the SA node impulses. So then you get more P waves than QRS. So the P wave goes, but then the QRS doesn't always happen. And ventricular fibrillation, this is going to be just disorganized. You can't really tell P waves and QRS complexes. And this is what you see in heart attacks or if you've had an electrical shock. Like if you got struck by lightning. Yeah, what does AFib look like? AFib is going to be also disorganized, but kind of smaller waves. All right, go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Be back at 9:05, and then we'll start.
But she was having going through ventricular atrial fibrillation, and there she was just sort of like, and her student was like super fast with cardiograms, so we just went in and saw what was going on with her heart, and it was, and she was like, it was crazy, you could see the blood draining from her face, and she was just like, and then it started again. It was like the weirdest thing.
Such an extreme intervention. And not be able to do anything about it. I think if I was fully trained to do it, you get in there and be calm under pressure, but if I had to just sit back and watch people.
Did you wear a jacket? Oh, okay.
I can withdraw them back in.
Yeah, even after this.
But it wasn't the one that we had. Stand up. 6:30. And it's 9. But I never went to.
I know.
Like, not 5 minutes.
I don't know, I don't like humidity, so I like to stay here. I don't want to But at some point, my hand gets warmer before
So those nights like this, that's our longest. That's your longest.
I put in more time in the winter, I enjoy summer.
As long as you're active, that's just fine. Because your practice is
Great Falls is like,
so but that's when we did that. Yeah. We're extensive.
oh, you're on the Gresham? Oh, you're gonna go to Gresham? Yeah. All right, let's get back into it. So my philosophy with the endocrine system is that there's no reason to just have a big list of hormones that you learn. I would rather you learn the hormones in the context of their systems. So we've already hit quite a few of them. We just talked about a bunch with the cardiovascular system, and then that will continue through the rest of the system. So if you get done with the endocrine system and you're like, you didn't spend very much time learning the hormones, I need to know the hormones, I think it's better to learn them with their respective systems. So more what we're going to talk about in the endocrine system is just kind of themes and how the hormones work with each other and apply that to systems that we already know the hormones. Sense? All right, so communication is just one of many types of communication. So remember at the very beginning we talked about things like gap junctions. So those are ways for the cells to talk directly to each other. So remember our cardiac cells have those intercalated discs that are allowing them to communicate cell to cell. So that works really well, it's really fast, but the cells have to be connected to each other. You can't communicate with a cell 3 cells away without going through those 3 cells. So it's fast, but it's localized. Same thing with paracrine communication. So this, you release chemicals, the cells are not connected, and we call these paracrine factors. But again, they're limited to a localized area, and the cells need to have the correct receptors. So if this cell doesn't have a receptor for this chemical, it's not going to be affected by it. So endocrine communication, those chemicals we call hormones, they can move through the circulation and go to distant areas. And again, a major theme of the endocrine system is that the cells have to have the appropriate receptors. Okay. So think about testosterone. When it gets released in high amounts during puberty, do boys turn into Wolfman? Do they get hair all over there, everywhere, on top of their feet? No, it's localized more to beard, armpit type areas, right? Because only certain cells have receptors for testosterone. So then we've already talked about, at length, synaptic communication. So that's also fast. We call those chemicals neurotransmitters, but those cells have to be right next to each other. But same rules as endocrine, the cells have to have the appropriate receptors because they're not connected. So how are the nervous system and endocrine system similar?
They signal, communicate.
And what do they use to communicate?
Neurotransmitters or hormones.
So those are both chemicals somehow. And then we call the hormones if we're talking about endocrine, and neurotransmitters if we're talking about nervous system. Name a chemical that's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Epinephrine and norepinephrine.
They both go to organs and muscles.
So they have distant, they're able to go to distant tissues. What's the rule for those tissues? Have to have receptors. Okay, what kind of feedback loops do we normally have in both these systems? Negative feedback. And that's to maintain what? So these systems kind of have a grander goal, right? So it's not like, digestive, we're getting nutrients, or urinary, we're maintaining fluid balance. We're keeping everyone in homeostasis. to memorize the structures of these hormones, but you do need to understand that there are different structures of hormones because it affects how and where they bind their receptors. So some are just derived from amino acids. So an example of that are thyroid hormones and catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And then melatonin is derived from tryptophan, so that's why they say that turkey makes you sleepy, because turkey is high in the amino acid tryptophan, and melatonin is made from tryptophan. Though really, when you look at it, it probably just could be way too much. Whatever, it's a small one. Alright, so then they could be chains of amino acids, rather than just a single amino acid up here. So some examples of those are antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and insulin. Or they can be proteins with a carb or sugar attached to them, like luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which we'll learn about in the reproductive system. Or they can be made out of lipids. So are eicosanoids like prostaglandin, or steroids like estrogen. So because our steroid hormones are made out of lipids, that's one of the reasons why your cholesterol tends to get higher as you get older, because you're making less estrogen or testosterone. So it's not like young people have healthier diets. It's actually usually the opposite. It's because you're using that cholesterol to make hormones. So again, you don't need to memorize the structure. I just wanted you to be able to kind of conceptualize what they look like. So the single amino acid hormones are very small, or you can have more complicated peptide hormones, or really complicated whole protein hormones like human growth hormone, or individual lipid hormones. So they vary a lot in size and structure, but they're all hormones because they're released into the circulation to bind receptors far away from themselves. This is one of the reasons why receptors have to be really specific to their specific hormone. So the receptor for testosterone is not going to bind oxytocin, because structurally those hormones are very different. All right, so these are in purple our main endocrine organs, but we also have many organs that have another job, but also make hormones. So these main ones pretty much are mostly responsible for hormone control. So hypothalamus and pituitary are going to be the master regulators. So they control almost all the other endocrine organs. Thyroid is going to be our metabolism and also calcium levels. Adrenal glands, mineral balance, metabolism, and our fight or flight response. The pancreas is going to control our glucose levels. So what hormones are made by the pancreas? Insulin. Remember the other one? Glucagon. Yeah. And then the pineal is mostly melatonin, parathyroid, calcium. So remember we learned about PTH, parathyroid hormone. So we've learned about a lot of these already. Heart. What are some hormones the heart releases to control blood volume? Half an hour. A long time. Natriuretic peptides. Thymus is going to be an immune response, hormones, digestive system makes hormones that control our metabolism and appetite. Kidneys, what are going to be made that control our blood cell production in the kidneys? What hormone? EPO, and then calcium production. And then how about some hormones made by the testes and ovaries? Estrogen, testosterone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. And then those are going to control growth and metabolism, sexual characteristics, and reproduction. So basically all that stuff that comes online when you get to puberty. All right, so this is the part about the hormone structure that is important. Whether or not they're lipid soluble or water soluble. because that controls whether or not they're able to go into the cell on their own or whether they have to bind the cell on the surface. So lipid-soluble hormones tend to be able to go through the plasma membrane, and so they can do things like activate genes and affect synthesis of new proteins. So those hormones, because they're lipid-soluble, they can move through the phospholipid bilayer of both the plasma membrane and the nuclear envelope and go in and directly affect gene expression. Versus the water-soluble ones, they can't make it through the plasma membrane, so the receptors have to be on the plasma membrane. And then they don't tend to pass into the cell. They work through things like second messenger systems, like our G protein coupled receptors. So they kick over the first domino, but they don't do any of the work themselves. They stay outside of the cell, bind the receptor, and then there's intracellular cascades that take care of the changes that are made by that hormone. So here are water-soluble hormones. So examples are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So most of those hormones bind to receptors in the plasma membrane. Because they're not lipid-soluble, they can't pass through the plasma membrane. So then, these tend to bind receptors. And what kind of a receptor is this? G protein coupled receptor. Okay? And then the downstream mechanism can be different, just like we've learned a lot of different G protein coupled receptors. And you don't need to know the exact pathway they go through. But you do need to know that the G protein coupled receptor activates a cascade of events that can do all sorts of different things. Open ion channels, activate, inhibit enzymes, and then it's just the binding of the hormone on the receptor that starts this process, and that's the only part the hormone is involved in. Which starting where? So the G protein coupled receptor binding to the hormone activates a cascade of events that can do all sorts of different things. It can activate or inhibit enzymes. But the hormone itself doesn't do those things. It just binds the receptor, and then the cell itself does this cascade enzyme.
Because of the type of cell it is.
So depending on what type of cell it is, the cascade of events can be different. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or you turn the key for the nuclear warhead, and then all this stuff happens. The key doesn't actually hit your enemies. It's the downstream stuff. So this is different from the lipid-soluble hormones. So an example of these are steroid hormones. So they fight their own battles. They go into the cell. They often still have a receptor that's inside of the cell. And this is something that a lot of students don't realize, is that the plasma membrane is not the only place you have receptors. There can be intracellular receptors. So these guys move into the cell, bind a receptor either in the cytoplasm or the nucleus, and that allows them to go in and directly affect transcription, and then make new proteins and alter the cellular structure or activity. So an example of this would be testosterone, lipid soluble, can go into the cells, but only the cells that have the receptor inside are going to be affected by testosterone. So one cell type that's affected by testosterone would be skeletal muscles. So they help increase the production of enzymes and structural proteins. So that's this process here. They bind those genes that make those proteins, make enzymes and structural proteins, and now you've increased muscle size and strength. Estrogen does this too. It's just slower. That's why no one takes estrogen as a performance enhancer. Testosterone makes you moody too, so just that. so here's another example of a lipid-soluble hormone. So thyroid hormones are going to bind the receptors on mitochondria. So why does that make sense? When you think about the function of the thyroid. Thyroid's involved in metabolism. And where do those metabolic processes occur? At that mitochondria. So that thyroid hormone binding a receptor at the mitochondria can activate those metabolic processes. And then it can also go into the nucleus and make more proteins involved in these metabolic processes. So those lipid-soluble hormones tend to be slower. Like, I'm not going to take a testosterone injection and 2 seconds later be superwoman. But they tend to be, they tend to make bigger and more long-term changes to the cells because they can actually affect the protein expression. Questions about that? All right, so there's multiple ways we can get our endocrine glands to release their hormones. So this is humoral stimulus. So this is caused by some sort of altered levels of ions or nutrients. So an example of this would be just low concentration of calcium can trigger release of parathyroid hormone. So the cell itself is figuring out what's going on outside of it, and that's what triggers the release of this hormone. Another method is through the nervous system. So remember, we have fibers that come out of that sympathetic nervous system that go to the adrenal gland and cause it to release hormones. So the nervous system can tell your endocrine organs to release their hormones as well. Or other hormones can tell your endocrine organs to release their hormones. So these guys tend to be controlled by the anterior pituitary gland. So they release, the anterior pituitary releases hormones into the bloodstream, which then can tell the endocrine organs to release their hormones. So you see the adrenal gland here too. This is the cortex layer of the adrenal gland is controlled this way, while the medulla of the adrenal gland is controlled this way. There are different hormones that come from different levels. You'll notice that the anterior pituitary is also controlled by another endocrine organ, the hypothalamus. So oftentimes you have 2 or 3 or even 4 hormones in a cascade. All right, so again, we can cause those hormones to be released through different ways, and the hypothalamus is actually able to do this in a couple different ways. So it can either indirectly or directly cause other endocrine organs to release their hormones. So it can communicate through neurons, and this is how ADH and oxytocin are released. It can signal through regulatory hormones. And these tend to be called releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. Or there's neural control of other organs like the adrenal gland. So that hypothalamus is kind of the master regulator of most of your hormones. Okay, so the neural control, the hypothalamus makes neurons that synthesize antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and then they travel down to the posterior lobe of the pituitary, which then actually releases the ADH and oxytocin. And how I remember whether it's the posterior lobe or the anterior lobe of the pituitary, I just remember ADH and oxytocin come from the posterior, and everything else comes from the anterior. So then remember, we also have these nervous fibers, so preganglionic motor fibers that are going to go from the hypothalamus to the adrenal gland for epinephrine and norepinephrine. displayed the blood vessels on top of this figure of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the hypophyseal portal system is a capillary network that allows communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the reason it's called hypophyseal is because hypophysis was the old name for the pituitary. So what type of capillaries would you expect to find in this hypophyseal portal system? Fenestrated capillaries. And why do you say fenestrated capillaries?
Because hormones are generally larger.
Yep, so we have those big gaps in the cells to allow the hormones to move in. So you see we have a capillary bed that connects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, but it doesn't connect the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Because this guy is communicating through these neurons, while the anterior pituitary is going to be triggered by hormones of the hypothalamus. So that's why there's the connection there. So again, ADH and oxytocin released from the posterior. And we call that, another name for that is the neurohypophysis because it's controlled by those neurons. While the adenohypophysis is going to be controlled by hormones. So the hypothalamus says to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, I'm releasing a hormone that will cause you to release another hormone. And then that anterior pituitary is going to release all these different hormones.
I thought that they were named because of where they derived from as fetuses.
I hadn't heard that. I will do some research on it. Alright, so these endocrine responses tend to form negative feedback loops, which makes sense. You don't want to continually ramp up any of your hormone responses. So the overall format that this usually takes is the hypothalamus sends out a releasing hormone through that hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, which releases a hormone, which can bind to receptors on an endocrine organ, which releases another hormone, which causes target cells to do something. And then at some point, one of these hormones feeds back to either inhibit the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus or to inhibit hormone 1 from the anterior pituitary. And sometimes both. So then over here, these are all color-coded. So these are examples of releasing hormones. These are examples of hormone 1 and the endocrine organs and then hormone. So when gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, it causes these two to be released from the anterior pituitary, called stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which then, depending on if you have male parts or female parts, will target the testes or the ovaries. That is the endocrine organ. Then hormone 2, estrogens, progesterone, does whatever it does in the body and target cells. So here's that growth hormone feedback loop. So in this case, the hypothalamus can either secrete growth hormone inhibiting hormone or growth hormone releasing hormone. So if the body needs to grow, if there's a feedback loop that says we need growth hormone, that's going to trigger the anterior lobe of the pituitary to release growth hormone. This one's also an interesting case because growth hormone itself has effects on target tissues and then causes the liver to release more hormone. So growth hormone causes epithelial cells to divide, adipose tissue to accumulate, and then activates the liver to release somatomenins, which stimulate growth of skeletal muscle, cartilage, and other tissues. And then somatomenins stimulate the inhibiting hormone and inhibit the releasing hormone. comes out, we go back and say, okay, we got it, we don't need to make any more protein.
Can you repeat what you said after it, the epithelial tissues divide?
Adipose tissue accumulates and activates the liver to release the somatobenins. And so here's a prolactin feedback loop. This one I bring up because it's not one that's active all the time, obviously. So when the hormone environment is right for prolactin to be produced by the anterior lobe, which has to do with estrogen and progesterone and things like that, then prolactin is produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which then stimulates the mammary glands to make milk. And we'll see a more detailed loop of this when we get to reproductive and how those other hormones play in. But that prolactin doesn't have a second endocrine organ it stimulates. It directly stimulates the mammary glands to make the milk. You don't always have a secondary hormone. And then it feeds back to both stimulate the inhibiting hormone and inhibit the releasing factor. So these are all the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary and their target organs. So again, some of them directly target one organ, like prolactin, while some target an organ to then release, target an endocrine organ to then release another hormone. While the posterior lobe, we just have these neurons that release the hormones out of the posterior pituitary rather than creating, releasing, or inhibitory hormones in the hypothalamus. They just directly release those hormones into the posterior pituitary through these neurons, and then those are ADH and oxytocin. And then ADH, one of the things that controls whether it's released is osmoreceptor stimulation. And where did we find those osmoreceptors? In your mouth and in your back part of your mouth, those back taste buds. So remember, when you drink a lot of water, that's going to inhibit your antidiuretic hormone, and then gives you a sense that you're not thirsty anymore. And then oxytocin, its function, it can cause smooth muscle contraction in the ductus deferens and the prostate gland. And then for women, it can cause uterine smooth muscle contraction and affects the mammary gland. So it's one of the things that helps cause prolactin to be. So they call that the bonding hormone because it's released during intercourse for both males and females, but then also during childbirth, then during breastfeeding and things like that. All right. So, given a general feedback loop and gonadotropin, see if you can draw the feedback loop that I haven't given you yet, and then talk about what osmoreceptors sense, how that triggers ADH, and would the stimulus be high or low to trigger ADH. So I'll scroll back here to the gonadotropin releasing hormone. See if you can draw that out.
Goes to the anterior lobe.
stuff because you're adolescent. And so your hormones are organized. And that goes through the ovaries and
Alright, let's go through it. What's our releasing hormone? Gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then how is it going to get to the anterior network of blood vessels called? Hypophysioportal system. Hypophysioportal system to the anterior pituitary. What's the anterior pituitary going to release? Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. We call that hormone number 1. So it's going to go throughout the whole body. Why is it only going to affect the testes and the ovaries? Hormones with the receptors. Okay, so the endocrine organ is going to be either the testes or the ovaries. And then what is that endocrine organ that's going to produce if it's the testes? Inhibin and androgens. How about if it's the ovaries? So then what do you think is the hormone that's feeding back to inhibit? Inhibin? Yep, right there in the name. So that rather than having estrogens or progesterone or androgens feedback, the reproductive system makes a special inhibitory hormone that feeds back and inhibits that gonadotropin release. If that seemed complicated, wait till we get to the reproductive system, because there's a whole timing of this with the female reproductive system and different levels. As usual, we're very Alright, how about our ADH?
What did LH stand for again?
Luteinizing. It's not. Right. We'll talk about it a lot.
Oh, okay. So we can just know it as LH.
Yes. What is LH?
Okay.
That's Alright, so what do osmoreceptors sense?
Water pressure.
So osmolarity is a measure of not water pressure, solute concentration. So we can tell that water has come in, but what they're actually sensing is solute concentration. Okay? So why does that trigger stronger antidiuretic hormone. Why does that have to do with antidiuretic? So antidiuretic hormone is going to be involved in your blood pressure and volume. And one way to adjust that is by drinking. So if the osmoreceptors were triggered because you were drinking something, what would that do to ADH? Decrease it. All right, so if you had a low stimulus, your osmoreceptors weren't stimulated, what would that do to ADH? Increase it, and that's going to increase thirst and prevent loss of fluid by heating. Okay, so we started with the hypothalamus and the pituitary. We're going to go through each of the endocrine organs just briefly. This is my favorite model in the book. Okay, so the thyroid gland is going to be below that thyroid cartilage. Below the thyroid cartilage, beneath your internal jugular on this side, and common carotid, and then above where you can feel your trachea. Okay. So if you look microscopically at the thyroid, one distinguishing feature are these big follicles. And these follicles are just pools of hormone. So what's actually going on in the thyroid is we're constantly making thyroid hormone, and it gets stored in these follicles, these pools of hormone, and then it can be released whenever we need thyroid hormone. And the thyroid's a really unique organ. It's the only place where we really use iodine. Where do we get that in our diet? Salt. And actually there's been some issues with people getting enough iodine because sea salt is becoming a popular thing, and all these Himalayan salts, all these specialty salts, and people aren't using the iodinized salt as much anymore. And this is the whole reason that we iodinize salt, is so you have enough iodine in your diet. Yep.
Doesn't that cause a big
Goiters.
Yeah,
Yep.
goiter.
Yep. We'll talk about why that happens. But basically, if you don't have enough iodine, you can't make enough thyroid hormone. And so those feedback loops say, I need more thyroid hormone, so surely you need more thyroid to make more thyroid hormone. And then you get this big thyroid that's not actually doing anything because it can't make thyroid hormone. Okay. So iodine, you get in your diet, and there's a pump that brings it in, and it's sensitive to thyroid stimulating hormone. So that's letting in the iodine. It goes through the cells. We take the tyrosine amino acid. It binds to a big protein that sticks that iodine together with the tyrosine amino acid and makes the thyroid hormones, which we call T3 and T4. And then when we need it in our bodies, it can endocytose back in, and then it's able to diffuse out of the cell. And then it usually binds these carrier globulins, thyroid binding globulins. Anyone know why that is? The hint is that it's diffusing through the cell. Right? It needs to be it needs to be able to get through the membrane. So it has to be. Yep, so because it's able to diffuse through the membrane, that thyroid binding globule actually keeps it from diffusing into everything all the time, and gets it delivered to more distant tissues. So then thyroid hormones are very powerful. They have a lot of effects on the body. And when they're working right, you don't really notice them. You're at your normal level of metabolism, your normal level of activity, but they can increase oxygen consumption and energy consumption. And in children, they can cause a raise in body temperature. They increase heart rate and force of contraction that rises blood pressure. Increase sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. So if you have too much thyroid hormone, you tend to be anxious and have a lot of anxiety, you can't relax. Maintain respiratory centers, so changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide, stimulate red blood cell formation, other endocrine tissues, and accelerated turnover of minerals in the body. So basically you're in active mode. Those thyroid hormones are making you extra active, and there's repercussions to that. I mean, you may think, well, I'll be so productive and so skinny, but then you're going to have osteoporosis because you're constantly using this energy, and you're anxious and angry all the time. Yep.
So I actually had a thyroidectomy, and I know when my levels are really off because I get really cold and really tired. So it's kind of like the
So
opposite.
it's the
of what you're
opposite.
saying.
When your thyroid levels are low, you can be very lethargic.
Yeah.
So then our, I'm going to talk about, anyway, about radioactive iodine. Okay, so parathyroid glands are on top of the thyroid gland itself, but they're different tissues with different functions. So even though they're located in the same general spot, completely different functions, different tissue. Though if you look at the cadaver, you can't tell where the parathyroid is and the thyroid is. So remember, we've seen this quite a few times. The thyroid is going to be in charge of our calcium balance through the actions of calcitonin, which is going to be in response to high blood calcium, which basically deposits the calcium and causes it to be excreted, or by the actions of parathyroid hormone, which causes it to be reabsorbed, released from bone, and absorbed by the intestines through the actions of calcitriol, and bring our blood calcium back up. That should ring a bell. And there's just that process written out in that. I think we'll wait to start the adrenal glands because they're kind of complicated with all their layers. Any questions?
Does the parathyroid gland only produce parathyroid